Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, going to SEC country, literally going to SEC country with Andrew Asselford, and you can catch him on SEC country. And actually, I was just checking out an article in which Lane Kiffin had made the comment that Dave Aranda is the toughest defensive coordinator that he faced in the SEC, both as head coach at Tennessee and, of course, offensive coordinator at Alabama. So this is the kind of work you get out of Andrew. So Andrew joining us for the first time. We appreciate you jumping on board.
Oh, happy to be here. Always fun to talk SEC football, that's for sure.
Yeah, so certainly Lane Kiffin, as a head coach at the Power 5 level, still has something to prove, but as an offensive coordinator, seemed to put the right pieces in place, which some would argue is easy to do at Alabama, but it seems as though he really opened up the offense. Looking at the situation currently with Alabama, of course, it's Jalen Hurts, it's Tua Tagovailoa, who most people would consider to be a huge front runner in this race based on what he did under pressure in the passing game that Jalen Hurts just hasn't shown the ability to do. Do you have any kind of different take on this quarterback battle?
It's going to be the story, I think, this spring and early fall in the SEC, the Alabama quarterback battle. I just think with what Tua showed in the national championship game, his ability to stretch the field, to really put stress on a defense in the secondary, I think he's probably the right choice for Alabama. I know it's really tough to overlook Jalen Hurts and what he's done. Just 2 losses as a starter in 2 years with the Crimson Tide, but I think Tua is a really dynamic player, is going to be a really good college player in the years to come. I think Saban will give him a fair shot. I really do. I think both guys will get looks with the same plays, with the same weapons at wide receiver in practice. I think they'll make this as fair as possible for both Tua and Jalen. But I think in the end, talent is going to win out. And I think Tua is a better quarterback for this Alabama offense, because you just saw in the national championship game, without Tua in there in the second half, Georgia is your national champion. So, he made a huge difference in that game for the Crimson Tide. And I think he'll be the starting quarterback for Alabama this year. But we'll see if Jalen can put up a fight. Who knows? You can't overlook what he's done. He's really careful with the ball too. Only threw 1 interception last year, so that's something you have to pay attention to. But Tua is a pretty special player.
The one point I make, Andrew, to people considering Jalen Hurts' challenges in the passing game is just understand that in the previous year, he did walk off the field against Clemson with the lead, having delivered what could have been a game-winning touchdown drive, and he really never got the football back in his hands. So he pretty much did his job. Yes, he didn't have a great passing game, but in the clutch in the last 2 to 3 minutes, he delivered the game-winning drive, or what could have been, never got the ball back in his hands. So not necessarily pinning the loss 35-31 on Jalen Hurts the year before against Clemson. Andrew Asselford joins us from SEC country. Andrew, we appreciate you jumping on board, talking some SEC football. We talked Alabama, and of course, Auburn and LSU are the 2 teams that come to mind during the Nick Saban era that have taken their shots at Alabama dominance. But most recently, of course, that team is Georgia out of the Eastern Division. And I don't know that you can get any closer than what Georgia performed this year in taking Alabama to overtime, a game that they should have won. So based on the last 2 recruiting classes, despite losing a load of talent to the NFL this offseason, it just doesn't seem to me like this is going to end anytime soon. And this may be the premier matchup in the SEC for the foreseeable future, Alabama, Georgia.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I think the SEC East is Georgia's for the taking for the next few years. I think eventually Florida will rise with Dan Mullen coming in from Mississippi State. He has a great reputation as a guy who can mold quarterbacks. We saw with Dak Prescott, saw with Nick Fitzgerald before Mullen decided to leave Starkville recently. So, I think Florida will get there eventually. But right now, what Kirby Smart has been able to do in building a giant program with the Bulldogs right now in a short amount of time, just 2 seasons, he got them to the national championship game. Like you said, nearly won it, probably should have won it. I think the Georgia chapter, as far as like building a national program, is only beginning right now. I think we saw just a glimpse last year of what the Bulldogs can become, and we saw just these dynamic young players coming into Athens right now, headlined by Justin Fields, of course, that really a talented 5-star quarterback who's going to be the face of the future, I think, for Georgia at that position. So, the Bulldogs aren't going anywhere. Of course, they came up short against Alabama. That was a tough loss for any Georgia fan, about the worst way you could lose in a high stakes situation like that. But I think Georgia will get the upper hand in time. And both Alabama and Georgia are just too good for neither side to dominate the other. I think there'll be some back and forth with this budding rivalry, and it's only going to get more exciting with time.
Andrew, I've made the argument that with Georgia emerging as a dominant player on the national scene and certainly owning the East this past season by a wide margin, that there may be the most dominant team in any division in college football. I think the other team that comes to mind, based on not just the quality of the team we're talking about, but the weakness of the rest of the division, would be USC owning the Pac-12
Sure.
South. Georgia, clearly the best team. As it stands right now, things change in college football very quickly. So you mentioned Florida. I would say that long term, meaning 2 to 3 years from now, that they have the resources and the head coach in place to make the best run at Georgia. But maybe South Carolina's got I'm not saying that they're going to challenge, but they clearly had the second best team this past season.
Yeah, South Carolina was a really intriguing case last year because, of course, Deebo Samuel, that really strong wide receiver, got hurt early in the year. Who knows what would have happened with the Gamecocks if he would have stayed healthy. He was great on special teams, too. Had a lot of breakout moments for South Carolina early in the season last year. So Will Muschamp has done a pretty solid job so far in Columbia. I don't know if there were very high expectations for South Carolina and Will Muschamp when he took over that job. It was kind of a program on the downswing after Steve Spurrier left abruptly. They were kind of in a tough spot. But Will Muschamp has done a pretty good job, I think. In some ways, you could argue, I think it's more impressive than what he did at Florida at times because, of course, he had high expectations at Florida, never really met those. But at South Carolina, he's really growing into his own as a coach, I think, and really pushing all the right buttons now for South Carolina. So, I think it'd be really interesting to see. Of course, they have a talented young quarterback with the Gamecocks right now. Deebo Samuel will be back healthy, and the defense too. That's Muschamp's strong suit. So I think they'll continue to be pretty strong in that area. And I still think, of course, like you said, Georgia is the favorite in the division, will win the division again. But South Carolina, I think, can be the second best team, or at worst, third best team in that division this year. And it'll be a really fun case to see what they'll be this season.
We go to SEC country to catch up with Andrew Astleford. You can join him and his coverage of SEC football right there at SEC country. Let's move it out to the SEC Western Division. Andrew, of course, for so many years, as I mentioned, Alabama dominating the division, LSU and Auburn being in that second tier, and then just about everybody else. Ole Miss obviously had their run for certain reasons under Hugh Freeze for a couple of years that we know much better in perspective why that took place. But Texas A&M, you can certainly rip apart Kevin Sumlin's tenure there for continuing to falter in November, losing 5 games year after year after year. But he certainly put the program on the national map with Johnny Manziel in particular. But really, his personality, his ability to recruit nationally and bring in top 5 to 10 classes. And then also now we're in a position where Texas A&M certainly can't keep that second tier or third tier status in the SEC Western Division. That's not why they brought in Jimbo Fisher. It's to gun for the top and Nick Saban.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with Jimbo Fisher. My personal opinion is that they gave him too much money, and he's not going to, work out in that way. They're expecting him to win national titles, and I think for a while, at least, the road is going to be very tough for Jimbo Fisher there because you have Alabama in the SEC West, you have LSU, you have Auburn, the team that won the division last year. I think Auburn will still be pretty good this year. So I think for a while it's going to be a tough road for Texas A&M and Jimbo. But he has that 10-year contract. They pushed out Kevin Sumlin in College Station for one reason alone. They wanted Jimbo Fisher to come in and win a national championship and do it fairly quickly too. So they have the resources at Texas A&M. This is a program that always was just kind of on the edge of being really, really good or one of the nation's best. They had a few breakout moments, of course, with Johnny Manziel and Mike Evans, beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa that season early on in the Aggies' SEC career. But, this is a program that kind of was average average and too average the last few years, and definitely needs to pick it up. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a tough task for Jimbo Fisher to match up with Alabama, Auburn, LSU these upcoming years. But we'll see if he can do it. He's being paid a lot to try to make it happen for the Aggies.
Certainly, as soon as somebody puts that championship ring on their finger, they gain a certain status. Les Miles would not be Les Miles without the 2007 national championship. The same with Jimbo Fisher. But there just seems to be a difference between a Nick Saban, Urban Meyer, a guy that's proven that they can go into a program and then win a championship, go to another program, win a championship, and do it repeatedly. Jimbo Fisher is a fine coach. There's no question about that. But of course, he had all the talent in play at Florida State. When he won the national championship, they had an extremely light touch of a schedule in the ACC, and he had what may turn out to be a first-rate, first-tier NFL quarterback in Jameis Winston. So taking nothing away from that effort, when you play Duke in an ACC championship game, you're not necessarily playing the best competition. He played like a 1 or 2 game season, and he hasn't done it again like the guys that I mentioned beforehand. So we'll see if Jimbo Fisher is up to the task in challenging Nick Saban, keeping all that Texas talent at home. And he's going to have to wrestle, of course, Tom Herman and others to do just that. And one of those,
it's going to be tough.
Yeah, definitely. And Andrew, of course, one of those schools in play when you talk about Texas talent is LSU, because they've got plenty of their own right at home, but they go to Texas. They're close to the Houston area. That I heard just an amazing stat about Houston high school football talent. It kind of rivals Atlanta in terms of a metroplex. Just some crazy statistics about how many 4 and 5 stars play there in the Houston metro area, and many go to LSU. LSU lines up as much talent as anybody in the country, but that one position, Andrew, seems to continue to be an issue. Whether they don't recruit the right guys or they can't develop the guys they recruit, I will let you try to sort out the LSU quarterback situation. But they certainly have 2 guys that they hope are the savior.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting, because you're right. I'd be being paid a lot more money than I am right now if I knew the answer to that question of why LSU can't recruit a quarterback. But, it boggles the mind, because is in such a rich recruiting area that we see the stats every year. There's so many players from Louisiana, Eastern Texas, that area of the country that go on to NFL careers. And of course, LSU's right in the middle of that. And they draw a lot of future NFL talent at LSU. And we see guys like Patrick Peterson and Honey Badger come through and have great NFL careers, Leonard Fournette, and they just haven't broken through and won an SEC title recently. So, it's just one of those things where, they need to figure out the quarterback position. I think Miles Brennan's going to be the guy at LSU. I think things are kind of leaning in that direction right now. It can change, of course, through spring ball, but this is a guy who became highly touted. He's a Louisiana guy. He was committed early on to the Tigers, wavered a little bit when things were a little shaky there with the program, but ended up going to Baton Rouge. And I think he'll be the guy that LSU's been wanting for all these years. They won't have the inconsistent play anymore in the pocket. And once that happens, I think LSU can be a contender in the SEC West, because this is a program that has all the other pieces. You have athletic players at wide receiver, you have running backs, you have defensive players each year at LSU who are among the conference's best. So, it's going to be a lot of pressure on Ed Orgeron eventually to make use of all the resources at his disposal, because he has one of the nation's best defensive coordinators, if not the best, and Dave Aranda, who's just got a healthy bump in pay because Texas A&M really wanted him to come along with Jimbo Fisher. So, Dave Aranda is still there. They had some trouble with the offensive coordinator situation last year. Matt Canada's out. Ensminger's in, so we'll see if that all works out. And I think that's still a question for the Tigers. But, if they can figure out the quarterback position, this will be a team, again, that will be one of the SEC West best.
If I'm a top flight recruit and I hail from the state of Louisiana at any positional unit, I definitely think about staying home at LSU, especially if I'm playing like cornerback or one of the famed LSU positions. But this Terrace Marshall, arguably the best wide receiver coming out in high school football, stayed home. And if anybody's dependent on another player on the football field, it's the wide receiver, because if he doesn't have a quarterback, then he's not going to go up. And man, I would just maybe not necessarily trust what I've seen out of LSU football in the passing game to be able to make that decision if I'm one of the very best. And we both know what these guys are thinking coming out of high school when they're this good. They're already thinking NFL.
Yeah, of course. Definitely.
One of the best with Terrace Marshall. We got Andrew Asselford on the line from SEC Country. Before we let you go, Andrew, let us know what you've been working on.
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier, I kind of talked to Lane Kiffin for a few things today. I have 2 stories up, one about Dave Aranda, actually, where Lane said he was the toughest defensive coordinator he faced in the SEC, so that was pretty interesting. And then an earlier one where I asked Lane, how would you handle the quarterback situation at Alabama this spring between Tua and Jalen? He gave a pretty thoughtful answer there. I'll let you go check it out to see his answer. But yeah, I'll have some more stories coming out in the next few days on that. And I handle just SEC-wide topics throughout the week as well. And on our website, it's always football season. So if you're in the need for some football right now during the peak of March Madness, check us out for sure.
You're a man after my own heart. That's what we do right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. It's college football all the time. So Andrew reached out to him on Twitter, and he was courteous enough to come on and share his football knowledge. So we talk a ton of SEC. Andrew, you're welcome back anytime.
Oh, I enjoyed it a lot and love to come back. Take care of yourself.